In addition, the land reaps the benefits of the annual rainfall, water that flows from the land to the sea. However, it has abundant supply all over the place, and accepts being itself and appreciating it, and it is in the near clay, releasing into the basins from which the rivers are absorbed. From a height, providing everywhere abundant fountains and streams, of which there can still be observed sacred memories in places where fountains once existed, and this proves the truth of what I said. Such is the natural state of the country, which is cultivated, as we may believe, is true, that makes their farms and lovers of honor, and of noble nature, and has the best land in the world, and the abundance of water, and in the skies above the climate is very good. Now the city in the days is set on this wise. But the fact is that the one night disaster that occurred rains and floods, at the same time there was an earthquake, and then there was a tremendous inundation, which was the third before the great destruction. Deucalion. But in primitive times the hills of the Acropolis extended to Eridanus and Ilissus, and included Pnyx on the one hand, and Lycabettus's borders on the opposite side to Pnyx, and all were well covered with ground, and levels above, except in one or two places. Beyond the Acropolis and down the hillside there are craftsmen living, tilling the land close by. The night class silenced itself around the temples of Athena and Hephaestus at the top. Moreover, they had been enclosed by a single fence like the garden of a single house. On the north side they had the same dwellings and had erected a room for eating in winter, and had all the buildings they needed to live with them, apart from a temple, but nothing was decorated with gold and silver, for they were made of no use. This is for every purpose. They take a middle path between ugliness and pride, and build simple houses in which they and their children grow up, and they leave them to others who, like themselves, are always the same. But in the summer they left their gardens and played and ate in the hall, and then the south side of the hill was used by them for the same purpose. Where the Acropolis is there is a fountain, which has been devastated by the earthquake, and has left only a few small rivers still around it. But in those days the fountains provided an abundant supply of water for all and a suitable temperature in summer and in winter. This is how they lived, became themselves citizens and leaders of the Hellenes, who were willing to become their followers. And they take care to preserve the same number of men and women through all time, which is so much as necessary for warlike purposes, then as it is now. That is to say, around 20,000. As the ancient Athenians, and after this way they should be given their own land and the rest of Hellas. They were famous all over Europe and Asia for the beauty of the people and for the much virtue of their souls, and all those who lived their days were the most famous. And furthermore, if I have not forgotten what I heard when I was a child, I will give you the character and origin of their enemies. For friends do not have to keep their story to themselves, but have them in common. Before going any further in the story, however, I must warn you, that you should not be surprised if you may have heard the Hellenic name given to foreigners. I will tell you the reason for this. Solon, intending to use the story for his poetry, inquired into the meanings of the names, and found that early Egyptian writing them had been translated into their own language, and the meanings of some names and when copying them out again translated into our language. My great-grandfather, Dropides, had the original writing, which I still have, and was carefully studied by me when I was a child. Therefore if you hear names like this used, you should not be surprised, because I have already told how they were introduced. The story, which is of great length, begins as follows. I have previously commented in speaking of the gods, that they divided the whole earth into different parts and made for themselves temples and sacrifices. And Poseidon received the island of Atlantis, begat children by a woman, and put them in a part of the island, which I will describe. Looking towards the sea, but at the center of the entire island, there was a plain which was said to have been the most fertile of all the plains and very fertile. Near the plain again, and also in the center of the island at a distance of about 50 stadia, there were not very high mountains on each side. On this mountain there lived one earth-born a man who was descended from an earlier civilization, named Evenor, and he had a wife named Leucippe, and they had only a child called Cleito, a girl who had reached adulthood when her father and mother died. Poseidon fell in love with him and formed a household in which he lived and created alternative zones of sea and land larger and smaller, surrounding each other. There are 2 lands and 3 waters, which are circular in shape, each having a circumference equidistant from the center. He himself, being the leader, found no difficulty in making special arrangements for the island, managing and developing 2 springs from beneath the earth, one warm water and the other cold, and making every variety of food spring abundantly from the land. He also gave birth to 5 sets of twin boys, and dividing the island of Atlantis into 10 parts, he gave to the eldest son of the eldest to install his mother's dwelling and the rationing around it, the greatest and the best, and make him king over the rest. In others he made princes, and gave them dominion over many men, and great territories. The oldest, who was the first king, he was named Atlas, and after him the whole island and sea was called the Atlantic. To his twin brother, who was born after him, and obtained as many of them from the tip of the island to the pillars of Heracles, facing the country which is now called the region of Gades in part of the world, he gave the name which in Greek is Eumelus, in the language of the country named after him, Gadeirus. Of the 2 sets of twins he called one Amphirs, and the other Evimen. For the older of the third pair of twins he gave the name Menasius, and the native to those who followed him. Of the 4th pair of twins he was called the elder Elisippus, and the younger Mestor. And of the 5th pair he gave to the elder the name Azes, and to the younger one from Diaprepes. All these and their descendants for many generations were the inhabitants and masters of the island diving of the open sea, and also, as already said, they held power over us all the lands in the pillars as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia. Now that Atlas had many and honorable families, and they were in the kingdom, the eldest son handed him over to the eldest for many generations, and they possessed such an amount of wealth as never before had by kings and rulers, and may never happen again, and they were equipped with everything they needed, both in city and country. For the greatness of their kingdom many things were brought to them from foreign countries, and the island itself provided most of what was needed by them for the use of life. In the first place, they excavated from the earth whatever was to be found there orichalcum, dug out of the earth in many parts of the island, which was more valuable in the days than anything but gold. Also whatever fragrant thing there is now on the earth, whether roots, or grasses, or forests, or essence sifting from fruit and flowers, grows and develops in the land, also the confessing fruit of cultivation. Both the dry kind, which is given to us for food, and the fruits have a hard skin, their water is for drinking and meat and holds a lot of oil if they give pleasure and amusement, and the fruits are indulgent with keeping, and the kind of delightful dessert, which we entertain ourselves after dinner, when we are tired of eating all this, that the sacred island then sees the sunshine, brings forth justice and is amazing and in infinite abundance. With blessings is the earth freely furnished them, while they continued building them temples and palaces and harbors and docks. And they governed the whole country in the following ways. First they bridged over the sea zone that surrounded the ancient metropolis, making their way to and from the royal palace. And in the beginning they built palaces in the abode of the gods and their ancestors, which they continued to make ornaments through the generations, each king making buildings which were magnificent to behold for their size and for their beauty. And starting from their sea a canal of 300 feet wide and 100 feet deep and 50 stadia long, which they carried through to the outer zone, making up a part of the sea up to this, which became a harbor, and left an opening sufficient to activate largest ship to find the entry. In addition, they were divided on the bridge by land zones which bisected the sea zone, leaving room for one trireme to enter from one zone to another, and they were covered in channels, thus leaving way below for ships, for areas far above the water. Now the largest of the zones where a part is cut from the sea is 3 stages in breadth, and the land zone which comes next is equal in size, but the next 2 zones, one water, the other land, 2 stadia, and the one that surrounded the central island is only wide stadium. The island where the palace is located has a diameter of 5 stadia. All this includes the zone and the bridge, which is the 6th part of the wide stadium. They are surrounded by stone walls on each side, placing towers and gates on the bridge where the sea is legalized on. The stones used in their work are excavated from under the central island, and from below the zone, both outside and inside. One of a kind was white, the other was black, and the third was red, and as they were excavated, they were at the same time concave double piers, after which the roof was formed from the original stone. Some of their buildings are simple, but in others they put stones together that are different, vary in color to please the eye, and are a natural source of fun. The whole area of the wall, which went around the outer zone, they covered with a layer of brass, and their next wall was covered with lead, and the third, which covered the fort, flashed with orichalcum red light. The palace on the inside of the fort was built on this sage. At the center is a holy temple dedicated to Cleito and Poseidon, which remains inaccessible, and is surrounded by a golden fence. This is the place where the family of 10 princes first saw the light, and there the people annually brought fruit from the earth in their seasons of all 10 parts, being an offering for 10 each. Here is the temple of Poseidon itself, which is a long stadium, and a half-wide stadium, and of a proportional height, has a strange appearance. All outside the temple, with the exception of the top, they were covered with silver, and the crest with gold. In the interior of the temple the roof was of ivory, oddly beaten everywhere with gold and silver and orichalcum, and all the other parts, walls and pillars and floors, they were covered with orichalcum. In their temple a golden statue was placed. There was the god himself standing on a chariot, a 6-horse charioteer, and with wings such a size that he touched the roof of the building with his head. Around him there were 100 nereids riding on the dolphins, for that was supposed to be the number of several bodyguards. There are also other images on the interior of the temple which have been dedicated by people personally. And around the temple outside were placed golden statues of all the descendants of the 10 kings and their wives, and there were many other great offerings from kings and private persons, coming both from the city itself and from outside the cities where they held power. There is an altar too, which in size and workmanship corresponds to this splendor, and the palace, in such a way, responds to the majesty of the kingdom and the glory of the temple. In the next place, they had fountains, one cold and another hot, in which many hearts flowed. And they are wonderfully adapted for use for the reasons of enjoyment and superiority of their waters. They built buildings about them and planted suitable trees, also they made wells, some open to the sky, others with more roofs, for use in winter as a warm bath. There are those of the king's baths, and the baths of private persons, which are kept separate, and there were separate baths for women, and for horses and cattle, and for each they gave as much jewelry as much. From the flowing waters they brought some to the grove of Poseidon, where grew all kinds of tall trees which were beautiful and a beauty, because of the superiority of the land, while the rest were thus conveyed the aqueducts along the bridge to the outer ring. And there are many temples built and dedicated to many gods, also gardens and training grounds, some for men, and others for horses on the 2 islands formed by the zone. And in the center of the greater of the 2 there is established a separate race course stadium width, and the length is allowed to extend along the island, for horses to race. There were also soldiers for guards, more trusted than those appointed to stand guard in the lower zone, which were closer to the Acropolis, while the most trusted of all had their homes in the fort, near those of the kings. The dock is full of soldiers and naval troops, and everything is pretty ready to use. Enough of the king's palace plan. These are the ubiquitous 50 stadia from the largest zone or port, the ends meet at the mouth of the channel leading to the sea. The whole area was densely packed with places to live, and the canals and the greatest of the harbors were full of ships and merchants who came from all parts, who, from their number, continued to rise the multifarious voices of men, and the din and clink of all kinds of the night. I have described the city and its surroundings from the ancient palace almost in the words of Solon, and now I must endeavor to represent the nature and makeup of the remnant of the land. The whole country that was said to him became very high and steep on the side of the sea, but the country immediately about and surrounded the city was plain of level, itself surrounded by mountains that descended towards the sea. It was smooth and even, and was rectangular in shape, extending in one direction 3,000 stadia, but across from the center of the interior was 2,000 stadia. This part of the island looked towards the south, and was sheltered from the north. The surrounding mountains are celebrated for their number and size and beauty, far beyond what is still there, for in them are also many rich villages of the country's people, and rivers, and lakes, and meadows supply sufficient food for every animal, wild or tame, and there are many kinds of wood, abundant for every kind of work. I will now describe the plains, as shaped by nature and by the laborers of many generations of kings through a long life. Is for the most part rectangles and oblongs, and where falling from a straight line follows a circular trench. The depth, and width, and length of this trench is extraordinary, and gives the impression that a work in such a way, apart from many others, could never have been artificial. Nevertheless, I have to say what I was told. Once dug to 100-foot, and wide depths were stadiums everywhere, it was carried out along the entire plain, and was 10,000 stadia in length. It receives a stream that descends from the mountain, and, a plain round turn and encounter in the city, is there releasing into the sea. Farther inland, too, a straight canal 100 feet wide was cut from through the plains, and again let go into a ditch leading to the sea. These canals were at intervals of 100 stadia, and by them they were brought down the logs from the mountains to the city, and conveyed fruit from the earth on the ship, cutting the cross-section from one canal to another, and to the city. Twice in the year they collect fruit from the earth. In winter it has the benefit of rain from the sky, and in summer the water that the land provides by introducing streams from the canals.